Welcome, welcome, family and friends. I am so very glad that you are here in this moment. Welcome to the Foundry Church, where we are all about a better you and a better world. We are in week 3 of our series called Nothing Changes If Nothing Changes. And what we're doing is we're walking through the 12 steps of recovery together. So step 1, we did the first week, which is to admit powerlessness. Step 2, which we did last week, is to believe in a higher power and that this higher power can restore you to sanity. And then this week we get into step 3. Now, before we get into step 3, I don't know if you've seen or heard or been connected to, but we do have a follow-up question study guide thing that you can participate with us in this process. Because like the recovery groups say, nothing, that's the title, nothing changes if nothing changes. It works if you work it. And so as we go through these steps, what we want you to be doing is participating with us as we go through this process. If you're looking for transformation, because it works if you work it. So that should be online. It should be on in our Facebook pages and all that good stuff. So maybe it's something you can do by yourself. Maybe it's something you would like to do with your life group or a group of friends or something. Take the time to be working through this. And as we go, this week and the next following weeks, it begins to get a bit more practical. And so to do that work is going to be really beneficial for you. So, did you guys hear about the chef who was really upset about all the coronavirus jokes that people were telling? He felt like they were in bad taste. Yeah. Did you hear the joke about the germ? Never mind. I don't want to spread it around. Actually, you know what? Before I continue, I had an idea for this. Since there's nobody here to laugh at the jokes, whether they be good or bad, I downloaded a laugh track that I thought would be fun. Can you hear that? So let's try this. I want to do a few more with the laugh track and see if this helps. All right. So what did the sick parent make their kids for lunch? Mac and sneeze. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. You know what they're saying about the year 2020? It went viral faster than anyone thought it would. Thank you. You know what they say? Feed a cold, starve a fever, drink a Corona. Oh, I'm sorry. There's other sounds. Oh, if you boo yourself, what does it say about yourself? Hey. There's so many coronavirus jokes out there. It's a real pandemic. Okay, good. Thank you. Let's see. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31 except for March and April, which seem to last forever. Thank you. What types of jokes are allowed during quarantine? Inside jokes. Hey! There we go. You're welcome for all that fun goodness. Now, step 1, admit your powerlessness. Step 2, believe in a higher power. Step 3, in one word, is surrender. Surrender. So here's the way, let me show you the way AA states it and the way Celebrate Recovery states it. Step 3, make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Celebrate Recovery says it this way: we made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God. And then they include Romans 12:1. Therefore I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. Step 3, surrender. Surrender is really, really difficult because we have these things called egos that we prop up. And when you combine the ego that you already have with a particular way of being raised and a particular worldview that you were handed, it becomes very difficult to get underneath all of that stuff to actually get to the place of surrender. We've got a lot of stuff that we're trying to keep in check, a lot of ways that we see and understand things. And it can be really difficult to sort through all of that to get to the place of actually laying it down. I mean, think about when we raise our kids. What are we teaching them? We teach them like how our family operates. You do this, I do this. If you have children, you teach your kids how your family operates. And the reason we teach them the way our family operates is because we believe we've got a pretty good system. We believe we know a few things. And look, this isn't always the case, but for the most part, the reason you live the way you do is because that you believe that it's a pretty good way to live. It might not be perfect. There may be other, little adjustments that need to be made, little rooms for improvement. But in general, the way you live is the way you live because you believe it's a better way to live. I mean, have you ever said to your kids, well, our family doesn't do that sort of thing? Yeah, why? Because you have a better way. Mom, the Jones family, they let their kids do whatever. Well, we're not the Jones family, are we? Yeah, we've got a pretty good thing going. So why would we need to? I don't think I've ever heard a parent say to their kid, we just don't really have it figured out very well. And really, we're doing okay, but you might want to adapt some other philosophy of life so that you don't end up like us. That's not a conversation that you ever hear parents have. Of course not. Because we're trying to teach our kids that the way we see the world is a pretty good way of seeing it. It's a pretty good way of doing it, a pretty good way of living out life. Most people believe what they believe when it comes to God or religion, all this stuff, because they believe it's the right thing. It's the better way. I've adopted this particular religion, this particular view and understanding of God and what God is like because I believe it's true, because it's the best one, because this way has changed my life. Says the Christian, says the Catholic, says the Muslim, says the Buddhist. And to attempt to convince a person in any one of these camps to choose or to take a different side is going to be highly unlikely. It happens, obviously. People switch and they rethink and think outside the box. But more often than not, it's very difficult to get somebody to leave behind what they were handed in order to gain something else. It's very difficult. You're not going to see a lot of switching teams here in this regard, right? Because we think we have the right way, and we all think this way. This is why surrender is so very difficult. You've got the ego that you're sorting through. You've got a particular worldview that you're sorting through. And it's very tough to drill down through all of that to get to the place that you're actually willing to lay your particular worldview and self down. Now, I brought along a few friends today that might help us to understand this a little bit better. These may be familiar to some of you. So, we all have a particular way to see and view the world. Let's see here. And we're going to use Mr. Potato Head to be our representative. Let's allow Mr. Potato Head to be our representative for how we see the world. This is our worldview. This is how we think of God. This is how we think of ourselves. This is how we think of our role within the world that we live in. Okay? Now, as good as our way of seeing things is, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, there's other ways to view the world. There's other ways to see things. There's other perspectives and opinions about how things are and how they should be. So let's, for the sake of conversation, ask our other friend here to join us. Oh, her ears are backwards. That's never good. It's hard to hear when your ears are backwards. Now, let's say Mrs. Potato Head here, she represents a different way of seeing the world, a different worldview, a different way to understand God, the Bible, religion, any of this stuff that is different from you. Okay, this is you, this is everybody else. Now, typically, there's a couple ways we can respond to different worldviews and perspectives. We can ignore or reject it, kind of turn our backs to it, pretend it doesn't exist, or not listen to it if it does, if we acknowledge it. That's one way we could respond to that. Another way to respond to a different way of seeing the world or worldview or thought process or opinion is to be aggressive and to fight, to attack. Poor Miss Potato Head becomes the victim of Mr. Potato Head's outrage at her thoughts on the world. We see this a lot, especially in our world right now, especially when it comes to things like politics, religion, the state of the economy, any of this stuff. We are very quick to get aggressive and violent, even if it's just like social media words that we or typing at one another. Or, there's always the other option to you have fight, and then you can have flight, and you can run away from the others and, keep your distance and whatever. But one of the things, so if this is our worldview and this is everybody else and this is how we see the world and God and ourselves and this is how other people think and function, whatever, what we rarely do, at least this is my perspective, what we rarely do is when confronted with a different way of seeing the world or things or life is accept it or embrace it. I don't know how that's a weird image, but embrace it. Listen to it. Rarely do we take the other into our perspective and think through it. Normally we respond in running or fighting or walking away from the whole thing. Now, this little picture, right, of us and other, it works on different levels, whether we're talking about just a worldview. Where I grew up is different from where you grew up, so we're going to see things a little bit differently. If you want to get more specific on a bit of a deeper level, you can go directly to politics, right? Despite whatever color pants you find yourself wearing, you think one way, other people think another way. And then what we have to do is determine how we will respond. Will we listen and have open conversations? Will we get upset and post nasty things on social media? Will we turn and reject and just say they're stupid and we don't have any time for them? How will we respond? You want to get a bit more specific and get a bit more personal? Let's talk about, your spouse, your husband, your wife. My guess is that unless you've been married for a really, really, really long time, and even then still, you're going to have different opinions about how things work. How should we spend the money? Well, I think this, but they think this. How should we raise our kids? This or this. Where do you want to go for dinner? I mean, this goes deep into the heart of how we are and who we are and how we function. And even the question as simple as, where do you want to go to dinner? It forces us to take somebody else's opinion, their worldview, their desires, and then decide how we will respond. Right? And the really big thing here, the next step to all this, that we don't have time for to get in today, and it's really a bit more complex, the thing that will really change who you are and what will really change your worldview is when you get to the place where you're able to remove the verses. It's not you versus them. It's not your ideas versus the rest of the world. It's learning that everything can be your teacher. And so when you come into contact with a new worldview, about embracing and trying to learn from it, right? That's the next level, deeper sort of thing, says the guy with the 2 potato heads. This is a difficult thing for us, laying the self down, because we believe the self to be right, and we're good at liking our own rightness. It's easy for us to appreciate our own rightness, or at least the thing that we think is right. And then so in the middle of dealing with the self and our worldview and who we are and how we respond to to different types of worldviews, in the middle of all that, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, this thing happens in the Bible where Jesus comes along and he says this. Let me show you Mark chapter 8. Jesus says this to us. Mark chapter 8 and Luke 9 says the same thing, just a little different. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily and follow me, says Luke. Daily. So what are we supposed to do with all that? We're driven by the self. What do we know of laying the self down? It's really difficult for the ego to surrender. Plus, this idea of surrender is not something that our culture values. In fact, I would suggest that we value the opposite. We value people who are large and in charge and take control. We value my way or the highway kind of people. In fact, this is such a big value for us. This is when you think about like politics in our country. How do we elect people that are going to run our country? Well, we vote for them. And who do we vote for? We vote for the person that we believe has similar ideas to us. And of the group of people that may have similar ideas to us or can closely represent what we think should happen, we try to pick the one that is the strongest, that has is the most stubborn, if you will, has the most willpower to get the job done. So, renounce the self, deny the self, surrender. All right. You know who surrenders? Like, it's the loser that surrenders, the people that didn't win that surrender. And yet, the only thing that will lead to lasting transformation is step 1, admitting powerlessness. Step 2, believing in a higher power that can restore you. And then step 3, surrendering the self to that higher power. If there is no surrender, if there is no surrender of the self, then there is no transformation. Well, I thought in order to bring the change to the world, in order to change myself, I had to take charge. I had to take life by the horns and wrestle it into submission. Oh, only through laying down the self will genuine, authentic transformation occur. Now, I want you to look at step 3 again. And there's this little bit at the very front of this statement that I think is really interesting. Step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives, I think there's supposed to be an S, and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. This little line, made a decision. Made a decision. It's this active thing. Only you can make the decision. When AA first got going in the 30s, they had all these groups that were meeting all over the place, and they noticed that there was this trend, this kind of pattern of once things got started, they would kind of quickly dissipate, and they were wondering what was going on. And so they began to reach out to all their various groups and say, you know, what kind of, it was all surrounding membership. Like, what kind of membership stuff do you have in place that's forcing people or keeping people away from what we're trying to do? So they had all the different groups send all of their membership regulations and rules to the head office, to the main people in charge, so that they could see the list of what was really going on in all these groups. And so then what they realized was all these various groups had so many specific membership requirements that people were struggling to stay in and to fit and last in the membership. They couldn't uphold the rules of membership. So let me show you. This is from what's called it's the 12 steps and 12 traditions. This is AA writing about itself and its formation and what's called the 12 traditions. So let me show you this. This is from what they say about themselves. And remember, this is like in the 30s when this whole thing is like getting started. Our foundation office asked each group to send in its list of protective regulations. The total list was a mile long. If all those rules had been in effect everywhere, nobody could have possibly joined AA at all. So great was the sum of our anxiety and fear. So they're saying, look, we had so many things set in place. We were so fearful of who we would keep in and who we would keep out that the list was so long that nobody could have ever possibly joined. They carry on. We resolved, this is them talking about themselves, we resolved to admit nobody to AA, but that hypothetical class of people we termed, in quotes, pure alcoholics. Except for their guzzling and the unfortunate result thereof, they could have no other complication. Remember, this is in the 30s again. So, beggars, tramps, asylum inmates, prisoners, queers, plain crackpots, and fallen women were definitely out. Yes, sir, we'd cater only to pure and respectable alcoholics. Any others would surely destroy us. Besides, if we took in those odd ones, what would decent people say about us? We built a fine mesh fence right around AA. We built a fine mesh fence right around AA. Hopefully you could see some parallels like between the church and this sort of thing and church membership. But that's not our sermon. That's a whole different thing. You know, like, have we built a fine mesh fence around the church? Who are we keeping out versus who are we letting in? And that's a different sermon. So how did they adjust? How did they move forward? After they realize this, they come to this conclusion, we got to make some adjustments. Well, this is where they developed Tradition 3. Tradition 3 says this: the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. The only requirement is that you have the desire. They go on to say this about themselves. Next slide. This tradition is packed with meaning. For AA is really saying to every serious drinker, you are an AA member if you say so. You can declare yourself in. Nobody can keep you out, no matter who you are, no matter how low you've gone, no matter how grave your emotional complications, even your crimes. We still can't deny you AA. We just want to be sure that you get the same great chance for sobriety that we've had. So you're an AA member the minute you declare yourself. You decide. Again, some really interesting ideas and thoughts in regards to like church and church membership and who's it. It's not our discussion today. AA says you become a member when you decide to be. You make the decision. And the decision, step 3, is surrender. To surrender your will and your life to God, to the care of God, the higher power beyond the self, because to trust to restore you, because ultimately you understand that you are powerless. Are you beginning to see how this all works together? You make the decision. Only you can lay the self down. Only you can decide how you will respond to the other. You make that decision. Now, a couple of sides to this thought that you make the decision. First is this. It's one thing to make the decision once, but it's another thing to keep making this decision over and over and over and over and over again, because this isn't a one-time decision. To make the decision is an everyday sort of thing. If I am surrendering the self, surrendering my will and my life into the care of God, this is an every moment, time and time again sort of thing. Like when I get up in the morning, I lay down my will. Like how I respond to my kids and my wife. Is it about me, or is it about me laying down the self? Or how I spend my money, or how I interact with. This is a continual thing, laying down the self, surrender. Even Jesus in our passage today said, deny yourself and take up your cross daily. You make the decision to lay the self down, to surrender, but it's a decision that you make again and again and again. Surrender takes practice, it takes repetition, and it's not something that comes naturally to us. The second thing is this, and this is kind of a warning, a heads up, just keep an eye out for this sort of thing. There's this term called, it's called the myth of heroic sacrifice. The myth of heroic sacrifice. And sometimes what happens is we confuse the myth of heroic sacrifice with true and actual surrender. Okay, so let me give you a few examples of what this looks like. The myth of heroic sacrifice. Our culture embraces, loves, romanticizes heroic sacrifices. Let me give you a few examples. If you go back in the history of our country, you go back to like World War II. Okay, what happens? The men go off to war, right? They're the heroes, sacrificing themselves for freedom of us and for the world and protection, all this stuff. Absolutely, that's wonderful, that's great. The men go off to war. The women stay in the States and they serve. They go to work, Rosie Riveter, right? It's heroic sacrifice. People are asked to ration or forced to ration all of their groceries and all this stuff, all their supplies. Why? Heroic sacrifice. People are asked to invest into the war, right, by buying these war bonds from the government. Heroic sacrifice. You do this thing, you are a hero. There is patriotism involved. It's a part of, like, we're all in this together. It's okay. Or what about the church? You hear people, when it comes to church, talking about God and the church, and maybe the church needs to do some expansion, or maybe we need to pay off debt, or whatever it is. And what do we talk about? We talk about how we just need a few sacrificial givers. Right? Give till it hurts, which is a weird thing, by the way. Like, God wants you to hurt in your generosity. It's odd. But that person then becomes like, if we can just get a few sacrificial givers, that's the heroic sacrifice. Wow, look at their spirituality. Or maybe you've got the person that's super spiritual, they're thought of as super spiritual, and they give a lot of themselves, their time, their resources, and we talk about them, oh, they're just such a spiritual giving person, and did you know he sold his new Ferrari so that he could use that money to open a rescue home for mentally traumatized iguanas? Oh, he's just so spiritual, right? Or when it comes to like athletes and musicians or famous people, we love stories about the personal sacrifice a person has made to get to where they are. And they would get up every morning 3 hours before the sunrise so they could go practice their drills. And he missed his prom because he was locked away in his room playing the guitar to go on to become the best guitar player in the whole. You see what I'm saying? We love the idea of heroic sacrifice. And there's nothing wrong with heroic sacrifice. There's a lot of good that comes with it. It's just not the same as surrender. It's not the same. You can see this sometimes with individuals, with the people around you. You ever know somebody that gives the appearance of being like extremely sacrificial? They're always giving of themselves to other people, always giving of themselves to other people. But then that sacrificial giving actually becomes an opportunity to manipulate or control a situation. You ever meet somebody like that? Sometimes it can be difficult to see. On the surface, it looks like sacrifice, but underneath, there's this desire to control. Maybe if we extrapolate this to its full extent, suicide bombers are sacrificial, but I don't recommend taking that path. Do you see? The thing about all these forms of heroic sacrifices is that sacrifice doesn't correlate to surrender or the dying of self. Because all of these heroic sacrifices, whether we're talking about the war, whether we're talking about the church, whether we're talking about people, it's still ultimately the elevation of the self. It's the propping up of the own ego, which is the exact opposite of what we're talking about today, which is the exact opposite of what step 3 is. In Matthew chapter 9, we see Jesus having dinner with some sinners and tax collectors, like the lowest people in the social scale, the marginalized, the outcast. And so the Pharisees take issue with what Jesus is doing, and then Jesus hears that the Pharisees take issue with what he's doing, so Jesus takes issue with the Pharisees who are taking issue with what Jesus is doing. And he says this, Jesus says this to the Pharisees: "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice." Now, who is he talking to? He's talking to the Pharisees, the guys who were all about the law, all about the sacrifices that the law required. They're all about the honor and the pride that came along with the sacrifice that they were making because of the law. And so Jesus says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Don't confuse sacrifice with surrender. They are not synonymous. We can live sacrificially. We can pursue a sacrificial religion and still completely avoid surrender. And then the thing that Jesus does is that Jesus invites us away from sacrificial religion. And the whole life and death of Jesus, what it does is it brought an end to sacrificial religion. The problem is we haven't done well with this because we do well with unearned grace. We don't do well with unconditional, unearned love. In fact, it makes us a bit uncomfortable. What most people seem to prefer is the way of the ego and the self. Right? We want salvation and this faith thing to be based on merit and sacrifice. No, we wouldn't say that out loud. Like, nobody wants to admit that. We still want to talk and sing grace, grace, grace. But when we come down to it, we want merit and sacrifice over unearned grace and love because we want control. And if the whole thing is based on merit and sacrifice, then I have control. And if it's based on unearned love and unearned grace, we don't have any control over that, and it makes us a bit uncomfortable. We get unsettled when we don't have control. And if I am operating out of a lack of fear, out of a lack of control, you know what I haven't done? I haven't surrendered. Surrender allows you to receive, to accept. Surrender allows the unearned love, the unlimited grace. You don't ever have to earn it. You don't have control of it. You don't decide who does and doesn't get God's grace. We don't do well with that, do we? You know, part of the beauty of AA is that it really doesn't have any room for the fakers. It doesn't have room for facades. It doesn't have room for putting on shows because it's all about starting with the surrender. It's all about either you make the decision to surrender or you don't. You made the decision to be a part of the group. We don't have time for playing games and being fake with this whole thing. Surrender becomes the starting point. You ever seen how a meeting opens or how people introduce themselves into a meeting? What do they say? They say, hello, my name is Seth, and I'm an alcoholic. Hello, my name is Bill, and I'm an addict. Hello, my name is, and I struggle with. The starting point of something like AA is laying the self down. Because what we're trying to see is that there is a better, different way that God has prepared for us, that God has in mind for us. But we have to lay the ego, the worldview, the perspective down in order to be open to what God will do in us. Now, there's a bit of irony here when you compare the steps between AA and Celebrate Recovery. Let's look at these again. Okay, make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. That makes some people uncomfortable. I'm going to talk about that in a second. We made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God, defining this thing. Now, this is not a bash. This is in no way meant to disrespect. This is just an observation. Both these groups are incredible. They're both doing great work. We need more of both. And actually, if the church were to adopt a theology of the 12 steps, I think we would be better for it. But in light of the conversation of surrender, I do find irony, for the sake of like conversation and stuff here. I do find I find it interesting when you look at these, if the step is surrender, which one of these actually speaks to a deeper level of surrender? Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Made a decision to turn our lives and our wills over to the care of God. Now, I would say, just thinking out loud, this one, the first one, the AA one. I would say their willingness to surrender is so deep, the desire for others to surrender is so deep, that they're actually willing to release their own view of God. They actually are doing the thing that they're talking about in step 3, right? Yeah, because here's the thing. Some people's view of God is not super helpful. And in fact, many people's picture of God may be an obstacle for others. I know many Christians who believe in a God that I don't believe in. So AA, by trying to remove this obstacle, this barrier, actually does the step by laying down their own views for the sake and the benefit of others, which I find fascinating. Now, you want to see the crazy thing about all this is that we push, we fight, we resist. We want our way because our way is the right way. Our opinion is the right opinion. If you don't see it our way, then I don't have any time for you. It becomes all this like either or sort of stuff. It's this very dualistic thinking. It's my way, not your way. And we're always at odds with somebody, and we're always trying to fight somebody, which then reinforces what we think we believe to be right. But what we've missed in all this is that something that Paul said in the book of 2 Corinthians, and that Paul has been right all along if we would have just picked up on it and if we would just implement it into our actual lives. Watch what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. For when I am weak, then I am strong. I delight in hardship. I delight in persecution. I delight in difficulty. Because when I am weak, then I am strong. You see, we've been taught that to surrender is to be weak. And that weakness is a bad thing. And what we've missed is the acknowledgement and the recognition of our weakness, and how that acknowledgement and recognition allows us to tap into something deeper. That's the thing that actually gives us power. It's the acknowledgement of and recognition of our weakness that allows us to tap into the boundless love, energy, resources, and support of the divine creator of all things. So weak now becomes this new kind of strong. You see, but in order for you to actually access this, you must first surrender your will and your life to the care of God as you understand God. Oh, and by the way, you know something that's really interesting? Like in real life, when a potato is put in the ground and it's buried and you put dirt over it, you know what it actually does? Is it begins to grow and begin to sprout. And out of the death of that potato comes new life. So what will it be for you? You and your power? The limited power that got you to where you are? Or the laying down of the self for the sake of new life, for the sake of finding actual transformation? Step 3 says, I made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. When you begin to see this, you know what it'll do from a practical level is that it will actually help you by turning over my will. I'm sorry, Mrs. Potato Head. It might just help me to be able to see the world through other people's eyes. And then what I might see is that they aren't as much of an enemy as I thought, that we actually may have a lot in common. There might be a lot of similarities here. And maybe through learning to see the world through other people's eyes, we might be able to embrace one another in a whole new sort of way. But see, you'll never be able to do this if you don't first surrender the self. If you don't acknowledge that there are other ways, if you're not willing to lay the self down. When you really get this, I believe it will bring you to the place that you can say with complete honesty and complete sincerity, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I cannot change how they think and see the world. Help me to learn to be patient and loving with that. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, which is myself. And the way that I do this is by making the decision to lay the self down. And God, grant me the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Will you pray that prayer with me? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. My prayer for you is that you will have the courage to surrender. My prayer for you is that you will embrace surrender over sacrifice. My prayer for you is that through your weakness, you will begin to tap into the strength of the Creator. May God be working in you to create a better you. May God be working through you to create a better world. God bless.